Goodness, I'm so glad you're here. Pleasure to have you here. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, everybody. We're pretty much fielding timing, which means we start typically about 5 minutes late, which means we are on time to get a fielding event started. I'll do kind of a quick little blurb right now, and we are recording, which is great. Thank you, Brian. I'd like to say welcome. My name is Hilary Lyn. I am the Director of Alumni Relations here at Fielding Graduate University, and I am absolutely delighted for today's topic and presenter. Today we are talking about anti-sexist, challenging sexism, championing women's rights and creating equality. And we will be talking to Fielding alumna, Dr. Lynn Schmidt, who is here online with us. And I have quite a bit of an intro because we need to talk about what she's going to talk about. And we want to make sure that we're setting her up and framing the discussion for today. So before we get started, what I'd love for you to do is go ahead and open your chat if you don't mind. And if you want your camera on, great, please feel free to have your camera on. In chat, if you wouldn't mind letting us know where you're located and what program you are with, and if you've graduated, what year, if you feel like putting that in, or when you think you will be graduating, we'd love to see that. And another thing I'd like to share is this month is Women's History Month. And all month, we have had several different campaigns and events that have been focused on this topic. And we just had our 48th anniversary call across the globe. And the theme was gender equity today for sustainability tomorrow. And what we did is we have a social media campaign this month, and it's called Share Her Name. So we are inviting all community members to share on Fielding social media, or you can email media at fielding.edu, the name of a woman who has influenced you positively and why. So we'd love to hear those stories. We've had some fascinating stories, especially on our Facebook. So think about that. We'd love to hear from you. And so now we're going to go back to our, or actually you can put that in the chat too. That would be interesting to see if you think about this. So what I'm going to talk about right now is I'd like to introduce Lynn, and she just recently published a book, and that's also the name of the presentation today. As I mentioned before, Antisexist, Challenge Sexism, Champion Women's Rights and Create Equality. And there's a couple of testimonials, if you will, that were in support of her book. And I'd like to read a few of those before we get started, just so you can hear a little bit more about how important this book is at this time. We have someone here, Dr. Smith. He's an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School and co-author of Good Guys, How Men Can Become Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. He says, Dr. Schmidt delivered a much needed new toolkit that is concise and practical for anyone who wants to truly show up and take action as a co-conspirator and collaborator with women to stamp out sexism. Another one here is Marie Hemingway, founder and CTO of the Speak Out Revolution. Antisexist is a book that every senior leader who is working to achieve gender equity in the workplace should read. It's compelling, concise, and actionable. Dr. Schmidt makes being anti-sexist accessible to everyone. So as we probably know and or have seen or experienced, that everyone has sexist biases, implicit or explicit. A United Nations study reported that 9 out of 10 men and women have at least one deeply ingrained bias towards women, men and women. Sexism comes out in 4 outcomes: microaggressions, discrimination, harassment, and violence. Antisexist provides a compelling examples of sexist behaviors and practical action steps, which I'm looking forward to hearing about today. So you'll have takeaways today that will enable you to better understand and manage sexism. So to raise the issue of sexism, Fielding alumna, Dr. Schmidt recently wrote the book that I've referred to earlier. And she wrote this book to make it easier to understand what sexism is, how it impacts women, and one's role in perpetuating sexism and how to stop it. So she published her book. It came out on International Women's Day. And the theme of the 2022 theme is Break the Bias, which I thought was fantastic, Lynn. Dr. Schmidt is an expert in leadership development, and she's an executive coach who focuses on women's issues. She's a frequent keynote speaker at conferences worldwide, so we're so grateful to have her here today with the fielding community. Lynn is an award-winning author of 6 books. Her 4th book, Shifted to Thrive, received 6 literary awards. It was listed as one of the top 60 business books written by women in Inc.com. Quite the accomplishment. Her 5th book, Thriving from A to Z, won awards as Best Book for Personal Development. I have that book in my bookcase. And her 6th book, Antisexist, is now available. And she can connect with Lynn on LinkedIn, Twitter, and her author page on Facebook. So today, Lynn is going to share with us why she wrote this book. And she's also going to talk about her emphasis on research, which is great because being in this academic community, of course, we're going to find out how she came about her research with this book. So what we'll do is we're going to keep track of questions throughout the session, but this is going to be a very conversational time with us because we have the perfect number of people here. But what we'll do is Lynn's going to share with us about her research. And during this time, please feel free to put your questions in chat. And I'll take a look at that to moderate those questions. But at the very end, we will have Q&A. And we'll make sure that we'll have everybody's mics on and you can turn your camera on and we'll be able to ask Lynn some questions towards the end. When we get to that point, you can use the raise your hand feature. So you can find that down at the bottom of your screen. So let's get going. I've been talking so much now. We want to hear from Lynn. So Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today. And let's get started. And can you share what prompted you to write this book on this topic?
Yeah, thank you, Hilary. It's great to be here because I've spent a lot of time at Fielding getting my PhD, and then I did my coaching certificate at Fielding as well. So it's always great to come back and talk with and share with students. What prompted me, just to go back a little ways, my dissertation was on women in career derailment. So my passion for women's issues really started with Fielding and at Fielding. But I have a funny story to share, and I love to share this story because it shows you how much Fielding helps you grow and change. When I came to orientation for my dissertation program, I was at dinner with a couple of the folks from orientation, and they kind of knew what they wanted to work on. And they looked at me and they said, "What are you going to work on?" And I said, "Well, I have no idea, but it's not going to be about women. And it's not going to be a qualitative study." Well, my dissertation was obviously about women and it was a qualitative study. So I love to share that story because it just shows how much you learn and grow and change. And I learned so much about women and women's issues because up until that point, I was, about 40 years old. And even though I had experienced a lot of discrimination and harassment in my life, I was the kind of person that was just, I thought it was normal and that I just needed to be tough. I had to go ask for raises. I had to go ask for management titles when I was managing. I just thought, well, this is what you do. And so when I got with Fielding and started doing all my research, I realized, no, that's not the case. So I wanted to hop back to Fielding to explain why women's issues. But then more recently, probably at the beginning of COVID, or just right before COVID started, so this was about a little over 2 year, I call it a gestation period, that I started working on this topic. And when I was going to start working on it, I was going to focus simply on women and the workplace and what they felt in the workplace were the top issues that they faced as women because they were women. And I started interviewing and doing some surveys, but then COVID came and it was probably a good thing. It slowed me down and I started doing more research about women and women's issues. And I started to expand it. So then I said, well, no, it needs to be more than the workplace because what I'm seeing through my research is there's so much going on with women in the world of microaggression and discrimination and then harassment and violence. A lot of this taking place outside of the workplace, but it all has to do with sexism. It all starts with sexism. So I broadened my focus And then when I started researching, another reason I wanted to write the book the way I did is that when I started doing researching on all these topics, there was just so much out there. People tend, which is a good thing, people tend to specialize in these areas. So someone may specialize on the topic of domestic violence. Someone may specialize on sexual harassment at work. Someone may specialize on microaggressions. Someone may specialize as males as allies. And so as I started to get into it, my thought was, well, if I really want to help people, myself included initially, better understand everything that women face and really understand it holistically, I need to look much broader than specific singular topics. And how can I simplify that? So that's another reason I wrote the book, was to how do I holistically show this in a simple way that people can see the impact of most things related to sexism on women, see the full picture. And then also, as I started doing my research, I realized things aren't getting better. The numbers are getting worse. The United Nations is not going to meet their goals in regards to gender equality by the date set. Harassment numbers are getting bigger. Domestic violence numbers are getting bigger. Femicide is considered an epidemic. I could go on and on with the numbers aren't getting better. I mean, we get thrown token numbers. Oh, now we have 37 CEOs. We have this, we have that. But the numbers aren't getting better if you look at the full picture. So I wanted to write it to show that. Another reason is I think a lot of approaches to sexism are more about women changing. You got to lean in, you got to lean out, you got to do this, you got to do that. And I don't believe that. So this book was written to help women understand and address sexism, but not asking them to be someone other than who they are. We shouldn't have to be different to be safe and to have the career and the life we want. But sexism, pushes us to be different. And another reason I wrote it is I really just think, sexism is devastating. Those four outputs, microaggression, discrimination, harassment, and violence is devastating on the women, on children, on nations, on men, and no one's paying attention. So much of it has become normalized. I'm kind of writing the book for me is waving the flag and saying, hey, this is not okay, and we've got to get past the normalization and do something.
Thank you. When you were talking about the 4 outcomes of sexism, which is going to lead me into the question about your research, which when we had a chance to chat earlier, I was fascinated and really appreciated hearing is. So let's dig into the research. Can you share how you approached your research, your methodology? And for those of you who, she has this incredible matrix that shows the 4 outcomes of sexism that really puts everything together in what I think makes it really clear and understandable. So Lynn, would you mind explaining your process and how you came to the 4 outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. I really approached it almost like you'd approach a dissertation. I did a lit review, if you want to call it that. I looked at everything. I looked at a lot of the books and the articles and that are out there. Every morning I would wake up and say, what are the sexism headlines this morning? And I'd start, collecting those, posting those, reviewing those books, topics. I also did a survey, a pretty extensive survey with women, asking them, women around the world, asking them what were their top, kind of top factors. I came up with a list, and then I asked them to select their top factors off that list that they thought were most impactful to them in regards to getting in their way as far as types of sexism. I did some interviews. I collected different stories and also qualitative stories on that survey as well, and started talking to people. So gathering a lot of information, and that's when, I looked at it and I said, this is over. This could, no wonder people aren't paying attention. It's overwhelming. There is so much information, and someone may get focused in on domestic abuse, or someone may get focused on sexual harassment at work, or someone may get focused on, I got discriminated against in my job. Typically, our windows are pretty narrow on this topic. We may have an area that's really important to us that we focus on, but we don't focus broadly. And it's because it's hard. There's so much information. And so when I gathered all of this information, and that's what I said, what was nice about the slowdown of COVID is it allowed me to slow down and really start looking at it and analyzing it. And I tend to process a lot in my head. So I could give myself, lots of time to kind of mull over this and process all of this. And that's when I looked in it, and it made sense for all of these things that are outcomes of sexism to fall into these 4 broad categories. And then within the 4 broad categories, I was able to narrow it down. And it's not all inclusive, but each of the 4 broad categories in the matrix, so that's microaggression, discrimination, harassment, and violence, I call those the 4 outcomes of sexism. And within each of those 4, there are 6 specific topics. So that's 24 items overall. And like I said, it's not all inclusive, but it was, in my mind, and from talking to people in the survey, it was the most critical 6 items within each of those 4 topics. And that really brought it together, and I was able to shape the book. And then additional research from there. It's important to me to practice really what they refer to as feminist research, which is involving others and giving others voice. And so I have 11 essays in the book that were written by other people that tie to those 4 topics. So the book flows where there's data, and I use, I get pretty specific with data to support what I'm saying, that microaggression, discrimination, harassment, and violence are the 4 main outcomes of sexism. I support all of that with data. And then interspersed between those chapters are a couple of essays written by individuals. Their names are on the essays, where they're telling personal stories, anecdotes about how they were impacted either by microaggression or discrimination or harassment or violence. And then also interspersed throughout, essays are a little bit longer, about 2,000 to 3,000 words. Interspersed throughout my data segments are about 100 to 150 word anonymous, almost like quotes. They're stories, but they're so short. They're, you could refer quotes or stories that I gathered on a survey from people that that also support the data. So it's I created a flow where you've got a nice mix of qualitative and quantitative to support, the information that I'm proposing, the matrix, the 4 outcomes of sexism, to support it coming from both ways. And I think because of our short attention spans, I know I have one, I've acquired one, that breakup of data and short stories and essays makes a rather nice flow to explain the matrix and the 4 outcomes, but also to help people keep their attention and stay engaged and really learn from it.
Great. And thank you. As you were chatting here, I was taking some notes and looking at the 4 outcomes, and I'm just looking at discrimination right now, and I'm thinking about how you would recommend someone who is in a position of leadership and talking about sexism in the workplace. You have education, employment, wage gap, career, healthcare, and sexual under discrimination. How would you recommend someone utilize your book as a leader to better understand what they may be seeing, observing, or perhaps doing that they might not realize is sexist? And I know that you have some questions and exercises, and so I know that there's a very practical application to this book. So maybe can you speak to how you could utilize your book in that way?
Absolutely. So for me, and maybe it's my background as growing up in corporate America as a trainer, doing leadership development, and you teach, you teach something and then they do it, right? And So my books are all about having exercises and activities, and my role as a coach as well. That's how individuals learn. It's not by telling them, it's by having them explore and reflect themselves. So each of the chapters on the four outcomes of sexism, and then also in a little bit talk about intersectionality. There's an intersectionality lens that lays over that matrix that I bring forward at the end of the book, because the way a Black woman would experience sexism, or an older woman, or a woman with a disability, or a woman with a different sexual orientation, it's all going to be different because of intersectionality. And so it's really important to talk about that. But all of the chapters end with reflective questions, exploratory questions, things to think about, as well as the essays. So there's 11 essays, and what I had each of the essay authors do is end with 5 key items that they thought were the most important takeaways as regards to the topic that they were presenting on. So if you look at that, I've got the 5 key chapters, the 11 essays. You've got a lot of takeaways, tips, suggestions, things that you can use. And I think another important point about the matrix is that these 4 outcomes of sexism tend to escalate. So microaggressions, as you said, the United Nations studies said 9 out of 10 of us have deeply embedded biases against women. The rest of us generally have stereotypes and biases, and you never get rid of your biases. You can learn to manage them, but you never get rid of them. So essentially, we're all sexist. I raise my hand, I'm sexist. It's not, just the only way we can talk about it and change it is to be honest about it, right? And so we're all sexist, which is a key starting place. And the way most of us express our sexism towards women is through microaggression, which is the stereotypes. It's the language we use. It says micro, but when you're invalidating, telling someone they're being, a woman, she's being too upset about what she heard, it really doesn't matter, it's not important, or you're mansplaining or man interrupting, or you're, using stereotypical terms or words that are rather derogatory and demeaning. That's where we all start with our sexism. Then when that's accepted and not called out by anyone, and you think, wow, it's okay to think that women are less than. And oftentimes talking about children, this starts when we're very young, obviously media and home life and what happens at school. When you think that's okay, there's then a smaller pool of folks that think, okay, I can discriminate, or I should discriminate because women aren't as good. There's a smaller pool of folks, and that's men and women. So when you look at microaggression and discrimination, you've got men and women involved. When you move to harassment, which is an escalation of microaggression, that's primarily men, because this is about women, sexism towards women. Harassment is primarily men towards women. So that's where men, through locker room talk, through banter, through whatever, boys will be boys. There's a fewer number of men are thinking it's okay to harass women because they're less than. And I have a need to be in power and have control. So therefore harassment is okay. No one's called me on it. No one says it's bad, it's accepted. Then from there is where you move to violence. So men, once again, the violence against women is primarily men. And a large part of that is men, husbands, ex-husbands, boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, family members. It's people the women know. It's a smaller subset of men who, when no one thinks it's bad that they harass, it's acceptable. They move to violence, which can be everything from domestic abuse to rape, to femicide, to murder. And the example I like to use of this, that some of you may be familiar with, is the death of Sarah Everard in London, which was almost exactly a year ago. And she was arrested falsely by a police officer, a real police officer, kidnapped, raped, and murdered. At the trial, it was found that his fellow police officers, he would joke and make derogatory comments about women. The women officers were very uncomfortable with him, but nobody called him on it. Nobody stopped him. So there he is with some microaggressions. Everyone thinks it's funny. His buddies nicknamed him the rapist. And so it's accepted. So then he escalates to harassment. He actually went on and was flashing women. And he was turned in for that, and no repercussion. So he's like, well, that's okay then. Then he escalates to violence and he murders her. So that I think that's an important point to show that we've got to stop the sexism early, when, you know, with our children, what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're involved in. We need to call out microaggressions when we see them, when we hear them online, in person, because there is a smaller subset of people, if they're not called out, they will escalate to discrimination or harassment and then to violence. So that's just an important point about the matrix and the framework that I like to point out.
Thank you for that. It's fascinating to think about, you know, what we know. We hear stories like this, and what I was writing down here, as you said earlier, is the ebbs and the flows of awareness of anti-sexism. I mean, we had this in our conversation, you know, earlier, is the awareness of it. Sometimes it's always there, but it's not necessarily at the forefront of the conversation because different things going through the media all the time. But there's one for the ebbs and flows, but it's really concerning to have the numbers increasing. Can you talk to what you found in your research to speak to that?
Yeah, well, if you look at women's issues, you know, you've got I could go back further to getting the vote in that, but I won't. So if you go back to the 60s, you know, there was a lot of protests and a lot of changes made in regards to women's rights that happened in the 70s as well. Lots of laws that changed. Then if you go to the late 80s, it kind of died down again. Then if you go to the late 80s, there were a lot of workplace laws put in place to protect women, you know, and then it kind of dies down again. Then you've got the Me Too movement, which escalated and really brought forth, you know, a lot of information around sexual harassment in regards to women's work and how women were being abused in that way. But then, you know, something will surface, people will rally around it for a short period of time, and then it'll go away. And I think that just shows how deeply ingrained our biases are. And I think the other thing that's an important point for me that comes to what you said is the normalization of sexism, that we get to a point where we accept a lot of it because everyone's accepting it. And it becomes normalized, and we don't think anything of it, and we accept it. The other thing that I like to talk about, and this came out of my dissertation research as well, when you think about, you know, the ebbs and the flows, if you will, is denial. There's a lot of research that shows that anyone, if they're up against a real difficulty in their lives, they'll deny it's there. Simply because they don't want to have to deal with it every day. Who wants to get up? So in regards to women and sexism, what woman wants to get up every morning and say, you know, today I very possibly will experience microaggressions. I could be discriminated against. I may be harassed, and heaven forbid, I could, you know, something violent could happen to me simply because I'm a woman. The other issue is that, of course, misogyny. You know, there are women can support the patriarchy just like men can be feminists. And so the other thing you've got going on that leads to, you know, kind of an acceptance of sexism is that women and men there are women and men that truly believe that women have a certain place in society that leads to them behaving in sexist ways. And so those are some of the things that contribute to it. But the research, as I said, what it showed, I mean, everything I looked at, United Nations won't hit their gender numbers. No country has equality. harassment numbers are increasing, femicide numbers are increasing. 137 women are murdered a day around the world by a man they know. 5 women in the United States are murdered a day by a man they know. In England, London, one woman every 3 days is murdered by a man she knows. In Australia, it's a woman a week. You know, and I could go on and on and on. But, you know, look at those numbers. Where's the outrage? Where is the outrage? Everyone should have gotten outraged about George Floyd. No, racism is a horrible thing. And that's why I talk about intersectionality in the book. You've got, you know, there's a different impacts for women of color than white women. But where is the outrage? 5 women a day murdered by a man they know because they're women. You know, so where's the outrage? That's what I say.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what I'd like to do is, we're looking at time here. I do have another question for you, but just to prepare the folks in the audience, is we'll be opening this up to questions. So we'd love to have some people get on online and have some more dialogue with Lynn. But before we get there, and while you're thinking, is I'm looking at a report by McKinsey & Company, and there's a report that came out by Women in the Workplace 2021. I'll go ahead and put the link in the chat as soon as I'm done here. And I'm looking specifically in the corporate pipeline. And it's saying that, you know, women's representation has increased across the pipeline since 2016. However, women, especially of color, remain significantly underrepresented in leadership. They're also saying that women of color lose ground at every step. Representation of women of color falls off relative to white men, white women, and men of color at every step in the corporate pipeline, leaving them severely underrepresented at the top. So I'd be curious about your thoughts on that, but I'd also, the glass cliff concept, which I've been studying some in my ODL program, is how do we battle that in the corporate sector as women and supporting women? And do you have anything, because I know your background is in corporate, in the corporate world, as was mine before I came here. So I'm just curious about your thoughts or research as it relates specifically now, you know, the research in 2016 to 2021, and we're still so underrepresented in the corporate sector. Just curious if you had any thoughts or research around that topic.
Yeah, well, that's one reason why one of my last chapters in the book is on intersectionality. And what I do is I take that matrix of the 4 topics, and I lay the word intersectionality over the top. And what I say is to keep it simple, because the one intent of this book was to keep it simple. It's not an academic book. It's a book I would hope any man or woman anywhere, any place could pick up. It's got stories from around the world, you know, so I wanted to keep it really simple. So what I say is, to identify sexism is happening, first look at those 4 outcomes and say, how is this person experiencing, or how am I experiencing sexism within those 4 outcomes? Then lay the intersectionality lens over it. So does sexism intersect with another bias, which could be racism, which could be ageism, which could be ableism? I mean, women with disabilities really experience hardships because of that intersection. You know, obviously women of color as well. Sexual orientation, your McKinsey report, I used that as some of my research. Women that are lesbians, bisexual, trans women, you know, obviously those 3 experience quite a lot of, I call it double jeopardy, because of the intersection of sexism with other biases. And so, yes, it's interesting, you know, the McKinsey report is focused on the United States as such. If you look globally, the number of women in management is 27%, and it's the same number since 1995. It's been 27%. So while the US may have bopped up a little, somewhere else has bopped down a little. It's been 27% of women in management globally since 1995. So that's where I say my book isn't US centric. It's global. And when you look globally, while different countries have made some inroads, other countries haven't, or other places have gone backwards, like we're going backwards on women's healthcare now, where other places may be stepping forwards. And so that's what the data, the data shows. So if you look at women of color, and you look at the workplace, it is definitely more difficult, and all the research and data shows that. And one of the recommendations that I have, and one of the women who did an essay in my book talked a lot about, she's a Black woman, and she talked about her experiences in corporate America, which were not positive at all. And what we both refer to and talk about is the term ally or allyship. And, has that simply become a buzzword with no backbone? Because an ally is about really, as an ally, you're supposed to take risk. You're supposed to be helping oppressed or disadvantaged groups or individuals, and anyone can do that. It can be white men, it can be white women. A woman of color can help a disabled woman. I mean, anyone can be an ally if you've got advantage in an area where someone has disadvantage. But an ally truly is someone who's willing to take some risk for the individual that they're helping, for allyship to really be effective. And so that's one of the tools that both myself and Carla talked about, but it's truly stepping forward to be an ally, or she liked to use the word accomplice, not ally, in order to help individuals and really make something happen. It's not just a word to be thrown around. Another corporate word, sponsor, mentor, all of those.
So there are a couple of comments in the chat section, and I would like to encourage folks to, if you want to come on camera, I think we should have access to that, and sound. We'd love to have you on here. Thank you. It's good to see you. There's a couple of comments in here that I would like to acknowledge, and then the person that wrote it, if you would like to, please feel free to add on to it. First, Michelle, thank you. Is denial, or can the denial be viewed as a coping mechanism? Like, is the denial, or can the denial be viewed as a coping mechanism? Michelle, would you be up for maybe talking a little bit more? I think we were a couple points back, and I want to make sure that we are clear with your question.
Sure. I was just, I take it from the military background as well, because as a mom of a soldier who is often deployed to dangerous zones, I have to put that out. I have to basically bracket that out. To use some phenomenological terms, I have to bracket that out. And it doesn't necessarily become a denial in per se, but it seems like denial in these cases, in the case where, we don't always see it. We don't always feel it because it's a microaggression and we deny that it exists. Is it a coping mechanism? Because if we didn't put it in the back of our minds, if we didn't bracket it out of our world or out of our presence at the moment, it's almost impossible to mentally make it through the day, knowing that those things, that you're faced those every single day, all day long. I mean, even as a driver, if you're driving on the road and you make the wrong turn, somebody's gonna yell, oh, that's just a woman driver. Again, a microaggression that you live with. And it's like, I can't deal with that every day, because just because you feel that about me, I got to live my life, because I can't, I have to not deny it, but kind of bracket it out so that I could survive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, denial is a coping mechanism. And so, there's several reasons as to why sexism isn't paid the attention it should be. Denial is one of those, and denial as a coping mechanism, what women want to get up every day, like I said, and, but I am no longer denying it. Do I want to get up every day and say, I'm going to get microaggressions today? I could be discriminated against today. I could be harassed today walking down the street. I could be, you know, like I said, heaven forbid, I could experience violence today. All of these simply because I'm a woman. So absolutely. I think another reason that it's become normalized, some of it, especially microaggressions, and we have to stop that. We have to stop accepting microaggressions. We need to stand up for people when it happens, or ourselves, whether it's in person or online. And another reason is that it's because of women. When I brought up the issue of racism and how it's come to the forefront, who's addressing racism? Men and women, right? I'm going to just say it. Men and women holistically are engaged in wanting to get rid of racism. It's a good thing. Who's trying to get rid of sexism? Mainly women. There's a small subset of men, but when I was doing my research, it's a small subset of men that are out there in the forefront talking about sexism. So why is sexism taking a backseat to racism? Because sexism is only about women. Racism is about men and women. And so there's lots of reasons, you know, sexism isn't being addressed, but yeah, absolutely, Michelle, denial is a coping mechanism, absolutely. And we have to decide, especially with things like microaggressions, you know, we've got to, that's where it starts and that's where it escalates from. We've got to stop those.
Michelle, thank you. And I actually think the next question leads in really well. And this is from Dr. Allison Davis White-Eyes, who I would also like to acknowledge. She is our Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Fielding. And thank you so much for joining us today. But I appreciated this segue here is denial and misogyny. It's huge among women, sadly. So what do you say to a young mentee who is told that she needs to show up, show more confidence, otherwise people will see her as weak? This could be a talented individual who does not believe there is any sexism involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there, you know, are there stories to share? Are there examples to share? Are there people that she trusts or believes in who could share how they've experienced it? Can you have her talk through examples? Maybe she didn't see it at the time as sexism, but she experienced it. So can you have her, you know, could she talk through that and come to, you know, come to see it? But I absolutely agree. I mean, here, I told you, I started fielding when I was 40 and I walked in saying, I'm not doing a dissertation about women, even though I had to go and ask for a management title when I was managing people, even though I had to go and ask for a fair salary. And I knew I was in HR. I knew what people's salaries were, and I knew I was way underpaid. So even then, I was in, you know, I was having my denial, if you will, that, you know, this is just kind of how life is. So, you know, are there examples she can talk through, people she can talk to, things that can be pointed out in her life where she may have experienced it. You know, it's hard, but it's the closer to, I find the closer to home you can bring it, but you know, the maybe more open someone will be to seeing it. The other thing is I mean, there are women at all ages who truly believe, and I'm not saying this is the girl you're talking about, but who truly believe about these biases about women. I mean, they support the patriarchy. They truly believe women have a certain place in the world, and there is not a thing any of us will ever be, you know, I hate to say it, but white supremacists, right? I mean, their perspective on women. I mean, I don't know if we could do anything.
Mm-hmm. The next comment that I have here is from Dr. Cheri Gurse. And I'm sure I was wondering if you wanted to jump on, since I do see you on screen. If you'd like to say anything, I'll go ahead and read your comment here. She says that in the US, Black women, including Rosa Parks, demanded that attention about men's violence against women in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, they weren't believed, listened to by majority population. white women's anti-rape movement has been active since the 1960s to the 70s. But again, so many people haven't or believed this. Cheri, do you have any follow-up comments or observations or questions there? And you are on mute. Can I check? Am I allowed to? Okay, I'm going to ask to unmute you.
Here, I'm unmuted. I got it. Thank you. Hi. Well, full disclosure, I teach this subject, and I also about violence against women. Not everything that Lynn is doing, but that aspect in particular. And before I started to study for my doctorate at Fielding, I also, for 20-something years, I worked as a rape crisis and rape, what was called back then a rape prevention educator. So from the 1970s through the 1990s. And also another first, Lynn, is I just want to acknowledge that I so appreciate the full context you are bringing to this humongous subject.
Thank you.
Humongous, a real word. And so I wanted to say, to add this point about how women have been organized and organizing and collectively doing so for ages, for a long time. And just like with any other group or identities that aren't listened to, the same thing goes for women, especially about something that, as Lynn, you made extremely clear, is primarily, not only, but primarily done to us by men and boys. And so bottom line is, people haven't wanted to listen, but also, even more importantly, there have been people who listen, but who don't believe. And we know this, right, about every single intersectional identity category. So I was moved to write that little paragraph to add to something that someone I don't know, Michelle Simon. Yes, it's because Black people have demanded we pay attention, absolutely. But just like for African-American people and other people of color here in this country, when both white women and primarily originally Black women were really the first women in this country to organize around sexual assault. And that was in the unfortunately for them, it was in the 1930s and 40s, but that's because, of course, Black women were being raped and sexually assaulted mainly by white men, but also by Black men. And nobody was going to jail for it. No one was being convicted. So that's why I wanted to add to Michelle's important comment about how important it is that we do organize. And I just want to say, remind us, it's like, just as critical race theory is really American history, so is the fact that there has been a collective demand by women of all types in this country and around the world about violence against women. And of course, there have been, what's the word? I can't think of the word I mean, but there have been improvements, and
Yes.
we need to do that, and other people need to believe. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as Jimmy Carter said, this violence against women, this inequality, with women is the biggest human rights issue in the world. And that's why the United Nations has goals set worldwide. Each country has specific goals related to this, based upon where they, started at and how much they can achieve. And as I mentioned, it doesn't look like those goals are going to be accomplished. But so I agree with you. I mean, Cheri, it's not that it's not recognized and people aren't setting goals out there and women aren't organizing, in different pockets. It just could be maybe we're just not organizing large enough or big enough or loud enough or, yeah.
Cheri, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here. I do want to get to Julie had a question here. Julie, thanks for being here with us today. She asked the question, please feel free to come on, Mike, if you'd like to follow up. Can you talk about benevolent sexism? Is it necessarily a microaggression? And Julie, do you have any follow-up thoughts from that question?
Yeah, that's just something that I've become aware of. I'm 57 and I've grown up through and have had an interesting trajectory from being, when I'm a little girl, to being told, you don't be smarter than the boys, go to college and meet Mr. Right, protective paternalism, all that. And I'm just waking up to that. And how do you push back against that? The well-meaning benevolent sexism, it's awful. And sort that out, picture a microaggression. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually in my book, because the book, like I said, I wanted to keep it simple, but provide enough information to help people understand sexism. So I list the 6 different types of sexism. And one of those is benevolent. One is internalized, external, the relationship. So there's the different forms, and benevolent is where someone is doing you wrong by essentially thinking they're paying you a compliment or taking care of you. So for example, if you're a working mother, the person says to you, oh, we need to cut back, you can't travel anymore for your job. Because let's not have you travel anymore for your job because you're a mother now and it's best you stay at home. Well, the not traveling takes away maybe a bonus or takes away her advancement opportunities. That's benevolent sexism. Sexism in a detrimental way put forward as I'm doing something good for you because I believe women are these kind of people and and they need to be taken care of that way. And yeah, I absolutely, agree with you is that it can be a microaggression if it's just a statement about, oh, you're so nurturing or you're, whatever, if it's said in a nice way. But it can escalate, just like I showed, it can escalate to discrimination. It can escalate to harassment. I mean, the benevolent sexism, thinking that, especially, if you think about this example I just gave, that can escalate to, to discrimination, that you're not going to have the job opportunities because they believe that, they're doing the right thing for you because of what they believe women need as women. And absolutely, a lot of the things that I've come across on how to deal with that is more, ask people, and it may or may not help depending on how ingrained it is, but what do you mean by that? And just that simple question. It's even a question children can ask or adults can ask when they think someone is saying a microaggression. What do you mean by that? Can you tell me what you mean by that? And just pause and wait. This is if you're obviously in person or talking, a little bit more difficult online. But you could still do it, and pause and wait and see what they come back with, and try and have a dialogue about that. And at that point, that's when you can come in and say, well, this is what it meant to me. This is how it impacted me. And the nice thing is that even a bystander, a lot of us are bystanders or witnesses to this kind of behavior. A bystander can even do that. If I see something going on, whether it's in person or online, you can step in and just say, well, what did you mean by that? And then you don't say, well, how it impacted the woman, you say how it impacted you. What did you mean by that? Well, let me tell you how it impacted me. I felt offended for her personally, because, so those are some things, that I think have been very useful and beneficial as a way to start the dialogue. So it's not starting it in a kind of an attacking, way where a person gets on the defensive.
Thank
I don't know
you.
if that answers your question or not, if you have any.
It does. It does. And I'm trying to figure out how to get some of these men at work to stop saying ladies.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, goodness.
Our girls, or sweetheart, or sweetie, or girl, cutie. I don't know. There's a long list of that.
Well, Lynn, I think that last very practical, real example of how a bystander or individual would be able to address such a microaggression, I think that speaks to the many nuggets of valuable information throughout your book. And I've seen that listed throughout. So for those of you who are interested in Lynn's book, which I highly recommend, Brian, thank you, Brian. The link was just dropped into the chat, and please feel free to go check this out. And I just feel so thankful for Fielding alumni. I gushed before already with you, Lynn, that, working in this role is just such an honor, being able to see the impact of Fielding out in the world. And you're an example of this. And really the impact that you're making is important. It's valued, it's needed, it's critical. And I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you for being back here with the Fielding community. This truly is just such a treasure to have you here. And for everybody here on the call. And I know there were several people that emailed and said that they weren't able to attend, but they look forward to the recording. So just appreciate you so much.
Thank you. It was great to be here. And I have to say my Fielding journey was a fabulous, incredible experience that changed my life. So it's good to be back.
Good. Well, we're so glad to have you here. We're just wonderful. So I know that we're perfectly right on time here, 5:02. We're going to go ahead and close out, but just thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I'm wishing you a great evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.